Hello. So this hopefully mini video, I want to keep this short, looks at the steps that led to the fall slash opening up of communist Russia and China and how they kind of play off each other, specifically China taking note from Russia and its reforms. So starting with Russia, we know that after World War II, we become deeply entrenched in the Cold War, where we see the world broken up into three worlds. The first world, which is aligned with the United States and NATO, shown in the dark blue, and then the other allied states in the lighter blue on this map. And the Soviet leaning nations, often allied by the Warsaw Pact or other kind of satellite agreements, shown in the red. And of course, when you close in on Europe, we see that is significantly honored by the term the Iron Curtain. So there's that. But then we see in the gray all the non-aligned nations, which we did note before when talking about India, that there is a concerted effort to be neutral in this time period. And that is the third world, or the non-aligned world, led by India. And now we see those other nations, including some Scandinavian nations and some African nations. Also noted on this are some communist guerrilla groups with the red dots and anti-communist guerrilla groups, which we'll talk about more when we talk about the coups during this time period. But as we enter the 50s, we transition from Stalin to Khrushchev, seen here, hugging his buddy Fidel Castro. We do enter a new phase of the Russian communist history. The first step that Khrushchev does is the process of de-Stalinization in an attempt to have power more kind of under him and to break free from Stalin and his cult of personality and also his reputation. They're going to destroy all vestiges of Stalin. Like, you could really forget this face, though. I mean, let's face it. I love you. Anyway, so there's that. And of course, this is the height of severe tensions. This is the Cuban Missile Crisis and all those good things that we know happen. But once we lose Stalin, we lose that really strong authoritarian leader that can keep the unrest at bay. And we will start to see certain movements. A notable one is the Prague Spring that does happen in the late 60s. And this is actually post-Khrushchev. This is under Brezhnev, seen here. Look, eyebrows. The most ridiculous eyebrows in all of history. But anyway, the Prague Spring started when Dubček came into power. A transition of power happened. And his attempt was to start a program of socialism with a human face, right? To keep socialism, but to allow freedoms of expression. But over time, the Soviet Union became very threatened by this. So Brezhnev sent in troops and just crushes all of that. And then as we enter the 70s, now everything's falling apart for the Soviet Union, most notably because of all of the money and just time lost in Afghanistan, right? So there's a whole bunch of things that happen, but the Soviet Union is falling apart. And that's when we see Mikhail Gorbachev come to power. And Mikhail Gorbachev is known as a reformer, one that tried to get ahead of the collapse of the Soviet Union with two policies. The first is known as glasnost, which means openness, and specifically openness to criticism, right? To open up freedoms of expression, both political, religious, and otherwise, and to lift heavy censorship. And the second movement is perestroika, or economic restructuring. So to decentralize the economy, to open it up to privatization, and all of those things. And while this will have a short-term good effect on the economy, what it does is opens up this can of worms. And now we see this kind of weakness in the government, and any group that had wanted to be independent becomes independent. And thus we start to see nations like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania break free, and eventually all the stands will break free, Tajikistan and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, etc., etc. And thus we see the fall of the Soviet Union. So a lot of openness and the ultimate deterioration of that Soviet Union. But the original openness will affect the people in China. So transitioning to China, Mao Zedong dies in 1976, and they put him on display in a glass case as if he were Snow White. And still today, many people go on pilgrimage to see this. Kind of creepy, but shows their love for him. And we have about 2 years of party rule by the Gang of Four, and eventually that gives way, and there's a lot of party conflict. And we see the rise of Deng Xiaoping seen here. Deng Xiaoping is the reason why China is what it is today, this odd mix of capitalism and communism. And Deng's revolution modernized and opened China, whereas Mao's China was kind of stuck in terms of the modernization process and absolutely isolated. Deng will open it up. It will open up to the United States via ping pong diplomacy in the 70s. And his restructuring of the economy was founded under what they called the four modernizations, with the goal of modernizing agriculture, expanding industry, developing science and technology, and improving China's defense forces. And a main way that they did that is to open China up for trade. And first by focusing on very cheap manufacturing, by welcoming foreign investment. And they welcomed foreign investment by opening what were called the special economic zones, or these SEZs, which were parts of China in which if you were a corporation that opened up a manufacturing plant or some operation of your business there, there were tax incentives. Often you could do it for next to nothing, hardly taxes. And of course, the other incentive is that there's a gigantic workforce that you can pay very little. And one thing I want you to look for in the documentary you'll watch in class is even though we pay the Chinese workers very little, it's more than they had before. And so it does help to improve the economy and the general standard of living for most people. Of course, there are those factories, those companies that absolutely abuse the Chinese public. But there is, to be paid, $1 an hour, or I guess less, in a factory in China goes further, especially, in the 80s, right? So these SEZs will be huge in expanding the economy. Also, Chinese students are now allowed to visit abroad, which will lead to the migration of Chinese people throughout the world, but will also help to expand them internationally, and they'll bring new ideas inward, which helps. But of course, this odd mix of capitalism and communism has a variety of issues. First, workers' compensation and workers' rights are at a low. Also, we're developing at the expense of the environment. As we see here, the Chinese government, while it's reforming now, or at least it says it is, has generally been flippant about the international call to improve their industries for more environmental protection. So the pollution can be pretty bad. The other issue is that the Chinese public thought that since economic changes had happened, that they'd opened economically, that the political changes would have happened eventually. So they were waiting on that. And in the 80s, as Gorbachev is opening up Russia, right, via the policy of glasnost, the Chinese public thought that they would follow suit. So by the late 80s, we have a student movement that is eventually centered around Tiananmen Square that believed that was an inevitable process for the Chinese. So the student democracy movement, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, gathered a huge population of Chinese students and supporters around Tiananmen Square, and there were lobbies all around the country demanding democratic reforms via hunger strikes and speeches and artistic protests. So this is a process that actually went on for over a month, and in and out there's like 1 million people involved in this process. And you can see in these pictures, a great deal of civic participation. But of course, as everyone knows, the government eventually responded with force to this via tanks and invasions. How many students were killed in this is not known. Numbers range from tens to hundreds, and definitely many people were jailed for this. But it showed that while the Chinese government was willing to open up economically, it was not willing to open up politically. And still today, the censorship issues are huge. While people get around it, especially the famous Chinese firewall, does block access to information for the Chinese public, make it very difficult to peruse the internet. And we'll get into some other civic issues in China at a later date. All right, so there you have it, short one. So hopefully got some basics out of that, and we are going to expand upon a couple of those themes later on, but then that'll set you up nicely for our documentary on Friday and later studies. Okay, go do the reflection. Goodbye.